Hi there, and welcome to the first video in our series on Azure Enterprise Integration. My name is Dan Probert, and I'm the Chief Technical Officer at Affinis. You can find me on Twitter at ProbertDaniel, and I have a blog as well at www.bizbert.com. This series aims to give hands-on examples on how to develop integration applications in Azure, and we'll be covering standards, patterns, practices, and a whole lot more. The series is aimed at a number of different types of people, primarily developers who will be writing the actual applications, but also testers who might want to see what goes into development and how automated testing works. Operations and support staff, we have a section on monitoring and logging, which they may find useful. Technical managers who want to know what goes into designing and developing integration solutions in Azure. Architects and designers who might want to see how their designs are actually put into practice. And pretty much anyone else that's got a bit of technical knowledge and a lot of curiosity. There's going to be 12 videos in this series. Each video is around 20 minutes long. Each of the videos will be primarily hands-on. We'll be showing how to do development in Visual Studio. We'll be showing options in the portal. I think this first video is the only one that doesn't have any Visual Studio or portal usage. Each video will also be accompanied by a blog post, which will be available to download as well. And those documents will cover the same content that you'll see in these videos. At the end of the series, you'll also be able to download a complete document covering everything that we've covered in these videos. So looking at the videos, Part 1 that we're in at the moment, we're going to cover the challenges that we find in developing enterprise integration applications in Azure. Part 2, we're going to be looking at the Azure Resource Manager, so looking at ARM templates and resource groups and why they're important. Part 3, we'll be looking at Visual Studio and the project types we can use for Azure integration development. In Part 4, we'll be looking at how you do build and deployment inside Visual Studio. Part 5, we'll be looking at build and deployment, this time from Visual Studio Team Services, so continuous integration, automated testing, and automated deployment to your different environments. Part 6, we'll be looking at the layout of your solutions and your source code, and also providing some naming conventions that you can use for your Azure resources. In Part 7, we'll be looking at security and identity management, so both design time security using RBAC, role-based access control, and runtime security for your resources. Part 8 will be looking at what provision there is for exception handling and logging, and when to use what's built in and when to roll your own. Part 9 is looking at monitoring, so the Azure resources have a lot of built-in monitoring. To support operations team, we'll be looking at how you can use that and what additional options you have. Part 10 will be looking at common patterns. If you're a BizTalk developer, you've been working for a few years on BizTalk, you'll know that there are some standard patterns that you can use. So in this case, we're looking at the same types of patterns and how they apply to integration development in Azure. In Part 11, we'll be talking about how you design an Azure integration solution. So what things you need to consider and what would you need to document before your developers start work on the integration application. And in Part 12, we'll be putting it all together and building a real-life Azure integration application that uses everything we've learned above. So why is there a need for this series? Well, it's been almost 9 months since Logic Apps went GA in July 2016. It's been in preview for quite a bit longer before then. And we've seen some real growth in adoption and usage. We have quite a few clients who are already using Logic Apps, and we get inquiries from others. And talking to other developers out in the field, there seems to be an upturn in the number of people who are asking about Logic Apps who are putting Logic Apps applications into production. There's also been an increase in community content and tutorials. So you might be familiar with the BizTalk 360 Integration Mondays or Middleware Friday webcasts, and we're starting to see a lot more blog posts and Stack Overflow questions, to tell the truth, about development and Logic Apps. So there's more and more content that you can search and find that explains how you do things. However, there's still a lot that's missing. And especially for an enterprise, regardless of whether you're a small to medium or large enterprise, it can be difficult to know where to start. There can be a lot of simple examples out there, for example, how you might integrate with Twitter or Office 365, but there's not very many complex examples. There's one or two examples on how to integrate with SAP using the SAP connector, but not how you might do a real-life scenario with that. That will change over time, but right now there's not a lot there. And there's also very little enterprise guidance. So, for example, how do you do your development in Visual Studio? How do you handle source control? How do you lay things out? How do you handle check-ins and deployment in Visual Studio? How do you use Visual Studio Team Services for build and deploy for Azure resources? So there's some guidance out there, but specifically what do you need to do and what's the best practice for how you lay things out and create your scripts? How do you do testing? So there's some ability built into Logic Apps, for example, for you to create messages and pass them in via the portal, or you could use a tool like Postman that lets you call the REST API that fronts your Logic app. But what if you want to do automated testing? What are your options there? How do you handle your dev, test, UAT and prod environments? Are they going to be separate subscriptions? Are they separate resource groups? Are they one resource group with different resources in them? Again, there's very little guidance out there for an enterprise to follow. Hence the need for this series. What we're hoping to do is provide you with that guidance in this series in a form that you can take and either use as is or modify it to your own ends. Let's start with what we mean by enterprise integration development. When we talk about enterprise, we're really talking about development that's being done for a company. Often it's being done inside the company via its own IT department, or maybe it's outsourced to a partner. Those enterprises can be small, medium or large. And in this case here, we're only providing a partial definition of enterprise integration development. We're really only wanting to look at the parts that reflect the content that will be in the videos. So the first thing I would say about enterprise integration development is that it needs to follow a known and proven process. And that's because it needs to be able to scale to hundreds of developers and thousands of interfaces. You might think you're starting off with just one application in Azure, but by the time you get to your 10th or 11th, 12th application or beyond that, you know that there's great benefit in having a process that you can follow where you have some consistency every time you do development. I believe too that in today's world, enterprises, when doing integration development, should be using DevOps where possible. For example, most of you might have noticed that Microsoft have now moved to an agile delivery cycle for Azure, especially Logic Apps, where they work on a 2-week Scrum cycle. So every 2 weeks they finish a sprint where new work is developed and deployed into Azure. Now, a lot of larger corporations aren't used to that speed of delivery. For example, with BizTalk, you might be waiting 6 months to a year for a service pack, and you might be waiting 2 years for an updated version of BizTalk. So that means that organizations have time to react to change. But with an increased rate of development and deployment from Azure, businesses need to change the way that they do their releases as well. And DevOps makes that possible, where we combine developers or development with operations as well, often having all those teams sitting together in one space or nearby if possible. But what it means is that developers can work on small releases, which will then be put into production by the operations staff and maintained. And this enables a greater turnaround, a quicker turnaround for getting things out the door. And you end up building up your solutions layer by layer. With enterprise integration development, we want to use integration patterns. Those of you who have an architectural design background might remember Martin Fowler's book on enterprise integration patterns. A lot of those patterns made their way into BizTalk. For example, when we start talking about convoys or scatter-gather, we can use those same patterns in Logic Apps and in Azure as a whole. But it's one of the things that stands out with enterprise integration development, that you will be using these integration patterns. Another thing is that we want to produce quality code. Enterprises put a lot of time and effort into the development of their solutions, so they want to make sure that whatever process they're following will increase the quality of their code and decrease the number of defects that they have. This includes thinking ahead about production and maintenance. So when we deploy our application, who's going to be looking after it? How do they maintain it? Do the operations team have the correct training? That will mean involving the operations staff much earlier on in the design cycle. And lastly, enterprise integration development will provide guidance on operations and monitoring. An enterprise should have documentation that covers how the operations team will work with the applications. Usually there will be a run book or something equivalent. And the operations team will be trained on how to monitor those applications. Conversely, developers need to know what monitoring options exist and whether or not they need to do anything about those at the time they're writing their applications. Now let's look at Microsoft's existing enterprise integration toolset, BizTalk. BizTalk runs on premises via Azure integration solutions which run in the cloud. If we look at BizTalk development, a BizTalk developer can draw today on years and years of experience and content. Regardless of whether that particular developer has the experience, there are a lot of BizTalk developers worldwide. And there's many years of experience and content available on the web in blog posts, video tutorials, books, Stack Overflow, you name it. If you hit a problem in BizTalk, you can just go to Google or Bing and search for your problem and you will find an answer. BizTalk developers will also be used to developing their code on their own development machine, which will generally have BizTalk, SQL Server and Visual Studio and any other tools installed on it. They'll create some BizTalk artifacts like orchestrations, pipelines, schemas, transforms. They might also create some C# libraries and maybe some WCF services. They'll then deploy that code to the same developer machine that they're running BizTalk on. And then they will do testing on that same machine, generally unit testing or integration testing using something like BizUnit or an equivalent. After they're sure that their code passes their tests, they will check in their code. And then there'll be a manual or automated deployment to a different environment. So for example, if you're using the BizTalk deployment framework, that might generate an MSI file, or perhaps you might use the BizTalk console to export an MSI file to install your BizTalk application. Or even better, you might have a TFS setup that runs some scripts to build those MSIs for you and then automatically deploys those to your test environment or another dev environment. But most importantly, there's a lot of good books to refer to, going all the way back to BizTalk 2004, 2006, 2010, 2013. I haven't yet seen any books on 2016, but I'm sure they're on their way. The point I'm getting at is that there's a lot to draw on if you're a BizTalk developer today. Let's compare that to Azure integration development. So it's still very new. As I said in one of the earlier slides, Logic Apps only went GA slightly under 9 months ago from the date of recording of this video. And there's not yet a huge amount of content out there on how to do things, although it's growing every day. If we look at what an Azure developer needs to do, well, first of all, one of the main differences is that they have a choice of where they develop their code. For Logic Apps, for example, you can develop your code in the portal or on a development machine using Visual Studio. There's less requirement for developing C# libraries and WCF services, although they do have their equivalents. You can use functions to host your C# code, and you'd be using API apps instead of WCF services. Your code can only be deployed to Azure, not to your dev machine. This is quite a big change. So instead of deploying locally and testing locally, you have to know where you're going to deploy your code to. So you have to have a subscription that exists in advance, and you'll have to know what resource group you're deploying your code to. And you have to deploy that code before you can actually use it. It's also unclear how some resources are created locally. If you go into Visual Studio, you'll find templates for Logic apps and API apps and Azure functions. But you won't find a template for, say, an Azure SQL database or service bus or storage account. There are samples out there, but it's not as easy to work out what you need to do. There's also not that much guidance on how to do testing during development. So if you want to do unit testing of your Logic apps, you'll find a few blog posts on maybe how you use Postman to do testing, or how you can use the portal. But what if you want to write unit tests or test cases inside Visual Studio? There's not much that exists to help you there today. Checking in your code. This doesn't change all that much from when you're working with BizTalk. Again, there's not that much guidance. There's not a lot of guidance in terms of how you should lay out your solutions and your code for source control. But it doesn't change all that much from, say, doing on-premise development. We referred to this earlier, but how does deployment to different environments work? So if I want to deploy to test or UAT or production, how does that work? You're pretty much on your own. You have to make decisions that fit you and your environments particularly well. So you decide whether or not you'll have multiple subscriptions or whether or not you'll be using different resource groups. Again, we have a later video on this that will cover the benefits of each approach and what our recommendations are. And also, if you're an enterprise, chances are most of your developers are going to have some level of MSDN subscription. And those MSDN subscriptions will come with free credits and their own Azure subscription. So if I'm a developer working on my development machine and I need to deploy my Logic app, am I doing that to my MSDN subscription, or am I doing it to a corporate development subscription or something else? Again, there's not guidance on that, or there's no guidance that we have found so far on that, and we've had to develop our own. And lastly, there's no books to refer to yet. I'm sure some are underway, but at the moment there's nowhere you can go to find answers to these questions and issues. Hence this series of blog posts and videos. Now, development in Azure raises its own unique challenges, and we're going to talk about some of those here. First of all, the Logic Apps designer can't discover Logic apps or API apps or functions that haven't yet been deployed to a subscription. This isn't generally an issue when you're in the portal, because when you create a Logic app in the portal, you're automatically deploying it to your subscription. But if you're in Visual Studio and you write a Logic app in Visual Studio, and then you write a second Logic app in Visual Studio, and inside the designer in Visual Studio you want to find that first Logic app, you can't find it, because Logic apps will only find the Logic apps designer will only find Logic apps that have been deployed. So you have to know to deploy that first Logic app from Visual Studio before you start developing the second Logic app. In addition, there are some limitations on the Logic app designer and which resources it can discover. So inside the designer, along with all the built-in or managed connectors, you can also discover other Logic apps you've written, API apps and functions. But the limitation as of today is that the designer will only find Logic apps, API apps and functions that are in the same region and same subscription. So for example, if you create a Logic app and you place it in a subscription, in a development subscription, and you put that in Central US region, then you create a second Logic app and you place that in the same subscription but in the West US region. When you go into the designer for that second Logic app that's located in the West US, it won't be able to see the Logic app that is in Central US. Now I think this will change over time so that you will be able to find Logic apps that are in the same subscription but maybe not the same region. But as of today, you've got to design things so that most of your resources stay in the same region. This isn't necessarily a problem for a small application or a small business, but if you're a very large enterprise and you have applications spread across the world, this can start causing issues as you go forward. One of the new things you need to do as well is factor in the cost of execution when you're designing an integration application, and choose the best resources. So if you were working with BizTalk, for example, you've paid for the BizTalk licenses up front, and SQL Server and Windows and the hosting. So when you execute your BizTalk logic, your BizTalk applications, you're not paying any more because you've paid for all that up front. Logic apps differ to that. You're not paying for anything up front, but you pay per execution. And you need to factor the cost of that execution into your design. At the time you do your design, you need to think about the number of messages coming through and the number of actions that you're likely to have, and calculate the cost of that logic app per month, along with everything else that's being used. What's the cost of the service bus queues, or your SQL databases, or your storage accounts, or your app service plans? And you need to look at the entire cost and decide if you're using the right resources for the job. Logic apps are quite cheap to run per action, but if you design them badly and you end up with millions of actions running when they don't need to add, then you're paying more money than you need to. Some resources cost extra. For example, integration accounts and premium API connections are charged at a fixed cost per month, although it's billed daily. So that means that for some of these resources, like an integration account, you should be considering sharing them across applications rather than each application having its own integration account to try and reduce cost. So how are we going to address that in this series? First of all, we're going to go through and explain what Azure resource groups and ARM templates are, so that we're all on a level playing field and you understand how you use those ARM templates in Visual Studio, and why we recommend that you split one ARM template up into multiple smaller ARM templates. We're going to show all the different Visual Studio project templates and show how to create all the different resources that you'll need. For example, creating service bus namespaces and queues and topics, storage accounts and Azure SQL databases and all the rest. We're going to provide guidance on naming standards, solution layout, logging, monitoring and exception handling. And we'll show how creating stubs and ordering your development and deployment will help you with the Logic Apps Designer at development time. We'll show how to perform deployments from Visual Studio, and more importantly, how those deployments will help when you move to Visual Studio Team Services. And then also how to set up a complete Visual Studio Team Services build and deployment process. And we're going to show a whole lot more. We're also going to be building a solution as we go along, and at the very end we'll be covering the entirety of that solution. So this solution will include web apps, API apps, function apps, logic apps, an integration account, service bus queues and topics and subscriptions, and a number of connectors including Salesforce, SQL and service bus. As I said, we're going to show you how to create this solution bit by bit in Visual Studio, and also how to manually deploy it and test it in Visual Studio, and then how to automatically build, test and deploy it from Visual Studio Team Services. Right, that's it for part 1. The next video and blog post in the series is going to be part 2, talking about the Azure Resource Manager overview. Thank you for watching, and hopefully you got something out of the video today. Thank you. Bye-bye.